Welcome to our hopefully weekly class on the Parsha. We call it Nitzutzei, sparks, tidbits, small morsels of Torah knowledge, covering some aspects of the weekly Parsha. The name of the Parsha is Ki Tisa. Ki Tisa literally means, when I say literally, I mean literally, when you raise up. Ki Tisa es Rosh B'nai Yisrael, when you raise up the head of the children of Israel, which of course, if we keep it at that literal translation, it's hard to understand what exactly the Torah means. But from the context, it's clear that the word Ki Tisa here does not mean literally raising up the head. It means counting the heads of the Jewish people, and they were commanded to do so by each Jew contributing a half shekel, and they would then count the half shekels and know the total number of Jews who were over the age of 20 and eligible for the military. And the Torah says that when you count the half shekel, there would not be a plague, implying that if they would just count people by their heads, that could lead to a plague. And we find later on in the biblical book of Samuel, where King David counts the Jewish people and does not use a object like a half shekel, or another example that was used was counting them by their sheep. Each one had one lamb, but they counted the actual people in the days of King David, and as a result of that there was a terrible plague that killed many thousands of Jews. What is the reason for not counting Jews outright? Why can't you just count the heads? Why do you have to count something else? In the temple, for example, when they would count the different Kohanim, different priests, to see who would be eligible for various services in the temple, they would pick a number and then they would count the fingers of the people, not the heads of the people, not the people themselves. And likewise, when we want to make sure there are 10 men for a minyan and we are counting, we don't say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, but instead we use a biblical verse that has 10 words in it. Usually the custom is to use the verse Hoshea es Amecha in the Psalms, and we also say it in our daily prayers, asking God to help and save the Jewish people. And that verse has 10 words in it. If we don't know that verse by heart, people would say not 1, not 2, not 3, till we get to not 10. What is the reason for this? Is this some type of a superstition? Well, the reason, one of the reasons at least, is that when you count an individual, you make that person vulnerable, because you expose that individual as an individual separated from the group. When God looks at the group, he sees one whole, more or less proper community. But when you start looking at each individual and you see the individual flaws, then you become vulnerable. So counting the person directly is a way of subjecting them to more vulnerability, and that's why we count some other object. Now, as I mentioned before, the literal meaning of the word Ki Tisa is not counting, it's raising up the head. And in Hasidic literature, it does take it literally, but literally at a deeper level, that as a result of this giving of the half shekel, it elevated them to a higher level. Now, what's the highest part of a person before you're elevated? The head. The head is physically the highest part of the person, and also the mind, the brain that's contained within the head is the highest faculty of a human being. And the idea here is to uplift it, to raise it to an even higher level. Now, they were told to give a half shekel. Now, the question is, why a half shekel? Why not give a full coin? And there are many reasons given by the sages and by Hasidic masters and by many others. The two most famous explanations are that a Jew has to recognize that he is only a half. And that manifests itself in two ways. One approach is that he's half because without God you can't really accomplish anything. A Jew has to always know that he is half of the equation. There's another half to that equation. Whatever you do in your life, you have to recognize God's role. The other approach is that we are only a half, that we cannot be complete without the other. We have to recognize the inherent unity of all of the Jewish people. They sound like two separate explanations, but the Rebbe explains that they're really saying the same thing. They're just taking it from different angles. We can go both directions. Number one, we start with the direction that the other half is God. Well, if a person recognizes God's presence, and we know that our souls come from God, and as they are in their source, they're really all one. So then, of course, you would recognize the inherent unity with every other Jew, because we are all one in our source. Now, if God is not part of us, if we don't recognize the other half, then we won't recognize the other human half either. So by recognizing the divine half, that gives us a deeper insight into the nature of the other Jew. Conversely, when we start with the other person, well, how do we get to love God? We get to love God by loving our fellow. As the Alter Rebbe once said, that loving God is not complete without loving your fellow, because if you really love someone, you will also love the one that someone loves. Therefore, since God says, I love my people, by loving my people, you really show you're truly loving God. So the two halves manifest themselves in two ways, and one leads to the other. There's another interesting hint in the word for half in Hebrew that is used here. Machatzis is half. Now, the central letter of this word, it's a 5-letter word, so you have a central letter, is the letter tzaddik. That letter symbolizes the righteous person. If you take the two letters next to it, on right and on the left, it reads chai. If you read the two letters at the extremes that are distant from the tzaddik, it reads mes, death. So whoever it was who said this, but it's a very beautiful point, that if you're close to the tzaddik, you're close to the people who are righteous, you are chai, you are alive. If you are distant from that person, you are mace, you are dead. Well, of course, we're talking now, metaphorically speaking, that true life means that your life is one that is vibrant, in which your soul is connected to God. And who helps us connect ourselves to God? It's the tzaddik. Being close to the tzaddik, we're alive. Being distant, God forbid, we sever our lifeline, as it were, with God. The Chida, one of the great Sephardic commentators, known as Chida, is an acronym for his name, Chaim Yosef David Azulai, and others have pointed out that the half shekel is also a reminder of what it says in the Talmud, and Maimonides codifies this, that a person should always look at the world, his own micro world and as well as the macro world, as being evenly divided between good and bad. And if you do one negative thing, one sin, even though it's only one small sin, it's the feather, but it tips the scales in the direction of the evil, which brings destruction to the world. If, on the other hand, you do one feather of a mitzvah, even though you think it's inconsequential, you tip the scales in the other direction. That's the meaning of the half shekel. Shekel means weight. That's why they call the coin a shekel, because it was a certain weight of silver or gold, depending on the type of coin. So what a person has to remember, this is the way we bring atonement to ourselves, when we remember that everything in our life hinges on our little action, because everything else is evenly balanced. When God says to Moshe that every Jew should give a half shekel, Moshe was stunned. He didn't know how to do this. Which God says, throw the silver into the fire, and out came a half shekel, a fiery half shekel. God showed him a fiery half shekel, and he knew what to do. Of course, there's some deeper meaning to this. Why wouldn't Moshe know what a half shekel is? It's a coin, and you just take a half of that. And the Torah gives you the exact amount, that there are 20 gera in a shekel, so you give 10 gera, which is a smaller denomination. It's quite obvious. So one of the explanations is that Moshe couldn't understand how it's possible for a person just giving a nominal amount of money to charity, how that's going to be an atonement. Moreover, according to the halacha, you could even coerce someone to give the half shekel. In the days when we had the temple and every Jew had to give a half shekel every year, if someone refused to give, even though it's a small amount, they would actually confiscate that from you. Well, how could that be an atonement if you don't even have your heart in what you're giving? And the answer is that every one of us is fire. Fire is the source of our existence, this fiery nature of the soul. Soul is likened to fire, which flickers upwards, is constantly in a state of drawing itself, trying to be drawn closer to God. That's who we are. We are fire. And when we give something, even though we don't have a heart in it, the truth is our core, our essence of our soul is instilled in that giving. So never put down a person who gives, even if they give with the wrong intention, even if they give for ulterior motives. Of course, Maimonides talks about 8 levels of tzedakah, and the lowest levels when you give reluctantly, only after being harassed. But it's the lowest level of tzedakah. It still is tzedakah, which is the greatest mitzvah. Now we go on to the next major theme, if not the major theme of the Parsha, and that is the sin of the golden calf. And here we have to talk a little bit more in detail. The question that everyone asks, from the early commentators, even from the Talmud down to contemporary times, how could that have happened? How could it be that a people who saw the greatest miracles that humans have ever been exposed to, the 10 plagues, the splitting of the sea, and these miracles were not just miracles, but they were revelations of godliness. They saw God, Zek Keli Ben Veo. They pointed, they said, this is my God, and I will glorify him. And then when they got the Torah at Mount Sinai, it was the most powerful revelation of God that has ever come into this world, to the point that souls left their bodies and God had to restore their souls to their bodies. And they heard God's own voice saying, don't have any other gods, no graven images. And here they construct a golden calf 40 days later and worship it. This is one of the most difficult questions to answer. And the fact that it's so difficult is that even though many answers have been given, we still ask the question because we can't make peace with sin. And that's a positive thing. We can't just say, yeah, I understand it, it makes a lot of sense. So let's survey some of the answers that are given. The Talmud itself says, the truth is that the Jewish people could not have possibly sunk so low to create a golden calf. That was beneath them. God orchestrated it in order to teach us that even when a nation goes so low, hits the bottom, they can bounce back through tshuva, through repentance. So according to the Talmud, that answers the question very easily, although it's still difficult for us to understand, that God orchestrated it. We find a similar thing with the sin of the tree of knowledge, which was the worst sin that has ever been committed, brought death to the world. And it said that the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai reversed that sin, and the golden calf brought it back. So we see a parallel between these two sins, the golden calf and the tree of knowledge. How could Adam, who had one commandment, violate it, and he did it so soon after he was created and given that commandment? And the answer again is that God orchestrated it, that he would commit that sin, because God wanted the world to have to bounce back through its own efforts and not be a perfect world. At any rate, that's the first approach, the approach of the Talmud. Now, there are other approaches as well, ranging from, number one, it wasn't really the Jewish people who did it. It was the Erev Rab, the mixture of other nations that Moses took with him out of Egypt. When these people saw the miracles that the Jewish people were benefiting from, they wanted to join the Jewish people. And Moses, without consulting with God, accepted them into the fold. And since they were raised on idol worship, they couldn't get it out of their system. And the first opportunity they had to create an idol, they said, let's go for it. So it wasn't really the Jewish people. The Jewish people were only guilty of not stopping it, but they weren't guilty of actually participating in it. And the other approach is that, in truth, they never intended it to be a substitute for God. They wanted it to be a substitute for Moses. Moses is gone. We need a leader, so let's choose a golden calf. Now that doesn't make sense at first blush, because if you want a leader, you had Aaron. Moses delegated to be his deputy. You had Hur, Moses' nephew, who Moses delegated to be a deputy. You had Joshua, who was a young man at that time, but he was still someone who was in charge of the war against Amalek. You had other able people. You had other elders. Why pick a golden calf? And one of the explanations is that the reason they thought Moshe was an able leader was because Moshe had no ego. He was totally transparent. The Torah says he was the most humble people on the face of the earth. Nobody else could be as humble as Moses. So they felt, if we choose another leader, he has to be like Moses. And there is no other person like Moses, not even Aaron. So therefore, what we'll do is choose an inanimate object, and since the inanimate object has no ego, it'll be totally transparent, and God will channel his leadership through that inanimate object. God will somehow communicate to us through that golden calf. I once heard an analogy that if a person goes over to a king, takes the king's crown, and puts it on his own head, he'll be a head shorter. That's the greatest insult to the king. It wouldn't be as great an insult if you took the king's robe, but if you take his crown, that's sedition. That's the total betrayal. That's rebellion. But nevertheless, where does the king put his crown? He hangs it on a hook when he's not wearing his crown. Why isn't he upset that the hook is carrying his crown? Because the hook is not human. The hook has no ego. So there's no suggestion of someone else trying to usurp his role as king. That's the analogy given here. They felt that if someone else took the position of leadership, it's like taking the crown off the head of the king and putting it on someone else. But to take it, put his crown, so to speak, on the golden calf, that's not an insult to God. Their mistake was, even though they wanted it as a replacement for Moses, not as a god, it degenerated into idol worship, but it started off innocently, quotation marks, is because God is the one who chooses his leaders and the one through whom he will channel his words. And even though God chose Moshe, he didn't just choose Moses, he chose Moses and the ones that he deputized. And the people of the next generation, till this very day, there's an unbroken chain of leadership that God says goes through great people, but then even though they're not as perfect as Moshe, they are still the people I want them to represent me. I never chose to be represented through a golden calf. Well, what happens later is that God says to Moses, look what happens. Your nation, referring to the Erev Rav, the multitude, the mixture of nations that Moshe accepted into the Jewish fold, they have become corrupted. And God threatened to annihilate the Jews for this terrible sin. And God says to Moses, let go of me. Well, Moses took that as a hint, because Moses wasn't doing anything at that point. And when God says, let go of me, Moses took that as a hint that God was telling him, why aren't you complaining? Why aren't you praying? Why aren't you arguing with me? This is a very beautiful point, a very powerful point, that when God tells you, I'm going to do something destructive, you don't say, well, God, you're God. Who am I to argue? God was upset that Moshe didn't argue right away. God had to tell him and hint to him, leave go of me. Why didn't God tell him directly, why don't you start praying? Because then it would be God's prayer. And God wanted him to pray. So God says to him, don't pray. Don't harass me. Leave go of me, as a way of hinting to Moshe that he should take the initiative and pray for the people. Okay, so Moshe prays, and Moshe says, if you don't forgive the Jewish people, mecheni na misifrecha, erase me from your book. This is considered to be one of the most powerful expressions of devotion and self-sacrifice of any person in history, because Moshe asked to be erased from the book. That means Moshe's greatest asset was his relationship with Torah. And here he is telling God, I don't want to be part of the Torah if you cannot save and spare the Jewish people. Erase me from the book. And we're told that even though God did forgive the people, God wanted the world to know that Moshe was this person who had this tremendous self-sacrifice. And in the Parsha that coincides with Moshe's own passing and his own birth, Parsha of Tetzaveh, last week's Parsha, Moshe's name is not mentioned. He's absent. As the Rebbe says, the absence of his name is really the greatest compliment you can give Moshe, because the absence of his name means that this is beyond his name. This is his essence. His essence is self-sacrifice for the Jewish people. I'm going to skip over because I want to tie this in with something at the end of the Parsha. At the end of the Parsha we read that when Moshe returned from the mountain, now let me just make this clear, that Moses was on the mountain 3 separate times. After 40 days, after the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, which was God speaking the words of the so-called 10 commandments, Moses goes up to the mountain, comes down with the tablets, sees them worshiping the golden calf, which happened on the 17th of Tammuz, which is now a fast day. That's when they broke through the walls of Jerusalem during the Second Temple. But that was originally the day Moses came down from the mountain, sees them worshiping the golden calf, and shatters the tablets. Then he goes up again, 40 days, to plead with God to spare the Jewish people. And God says, okay, I want you to take some sapphire. You do the hewing of the sapphire. First tablets, God provided all the material. Now it's your material, and bring it up to me, and I will etch on them the 10 commandments and give you a second set of commandments, which Moshe brought down 120 days after he first went up to the mountain, and that was on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is the reason, historically speaking, why it is the Day of Atonement, because that's when God demonstrated his full forgiveness of the Jewish people by giving them the second tablets. Now the Torah mentions at the end of this week's portion that when Moshe returned from the mountain, Karan Panav, his face radiated with light. It was a blinding light. He had to put a mask on his face, except when he was teaching the people. The question is asked, why, and Rashi asked this question, why didn't he have this radiant face when he returned from the mountain the first time? It doesn't say that he had a radiant face the first time. That is a question that Rashi asks. Rashi is the primary commentator. And Rashi answers, first he asked the question, from where? What was the source of this radiant light that emanated from his face? And Rashi says, our rabbis tell us that it came from the cave. Moshe, we learned before, hid in a cave, and God put his hand on his face. As it says, I will cover your face with my hands. And that gave him the light, and that happened after the first tablets. I once heard an explanation given by Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, known affectionately as Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, the great modern Orthodox sage of the 20th century. And he said something very beautiful. He said, when Moshe returned from the mountain the first time, he returned as a Rosh Yeshiva, as a Talmudic scholar who's going to be giving lectures in advanced Talmudic scholarship. He came as an academic.
Good.
An academic, as great as that is, teaching Torah, his face didn't shine. The second time he came down as he came down as a leader who cared for his people, who was willing to give up everything for the sake of his people. Coming down as a Rebbe, his face radiated with light. That's Rabbi Soloveitchik's. So that ties in with what I said before, that Moses, by saying, erase me, that earned Moses not only the greatest of praise, but that caused his face to radiate light. And in fact, the very last verse of the Torah where it talks about Moses, God eulogizes Moses. What does the Torah say? What was his great achievement? His greatest achievement, the very last verse of the Torah, it's about the things that he did in the presence of all of Israel. Moses did a few things in the presence of all of Israel. What does Rashi say was his greatest achievement? The shattering of the tablets. Why is shattering the tablets the greatest achievement? It's because that demonstrated that he was willing to give up everything for the sake of the Jewish people. He was the consummate leader who set the tone for leadership of the future. In our own generation, the Rebbe was a perfect example of that type of self-sacrifice for the sake of the Jewish people. Now, in the creating of the golden calf, they came to Aaron. Actually, they first came to Hur, Moses' nephew, who was one of the two people Moses put in charge in his absence. And we don't hear about Hur anymore, and our sages tell us, because Hur said no to the golden calf project, and they killed him. Aaron was concerned that they might kill him. He didn't care for his life as much as he cared for the fact that if they would have killed him, that would have been such a egregious sin. In addition to a golden calf, in addition to murdering Hur, they would have murdered the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, whose role is to be the intercessor between God and the Jewish people. And here they murder him, they would have been lost. So actually he would rather have died, but in the case of the golden calf, that would have proven to be very bad for the Jewish people. So Aaron tries to delay. So he says, take the earrings, the jewelry, from your wives and your children. Why did he say that? If you read the verses carefully, the Torah says they took their own jewelry. If you want to look in the text, those who are following by the text, you go to chapter 32, verse 2. Aaron said to them, remove the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, sons and daughters, and bring them to me. And what does the Torah say in verse 3? The entire people removed the gold rings that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. It doesn't say the ears of their wives and children, because the women, our sages tell us, refused to contribute their jewelry. So people will say, oh, that's because the Torah believes that women are so much into their jewelry that they wouldn't give it away for anything. Well, to dispel that distortion, in the next Torah portion we read how when the Jews had to bring contributions for the Mishkan, for the tabernacle, the women gave first, and they actually dragged their husbands with them to give. They were willing to give away everything for a holy cause. And because the women did not participate in the golden calf at all, they were rewarded that the holiday of Rosh Chodesh, the first of every Jewish month, is a woman's holiday. Women have a custom not to do certain domestic chores as a way of remembering that this is their holiday. Why is Rosh Chodesh, the first of the month, considered to be a women's holiday? Because of the lunar cycle, the monthly cycle, that means that women have an internal biological system that puts them in a natural setting to do God's will. this is not the time and place to go into it in depth, but just to mention that from the perspective of Jewish mysticism, women have a natural propensity to conform to God's will. That's why some women make a blessing in the morning, "Blessed are you, God, who has made me in accordance with your will." And a woman is naturally inclined to follow God's will. Of course, women have free choice and they could go against their nature. Men, on the other hand, are naturally inclined to be rebellious and independent, and they have to. That's why men have more obligations than women, especially the obligations that deal with restricting and confining and tying yourself down to a certain discipline, such as the mitzvah of tefillin and so on and so forth. At any rate, where did it all begin? Where do we see this being acted out on? Is when the women refuse to participate in contributing their jewelry for the golden calf. God says to Moses, "Lech red, go, descend, go down." So Rashi says, God says, "You're demoted." Why don't I give you greatness? For the people. If the people went downhill, you are also demoted. Some commentators, Hasidic commentators, point out that the word for descend, raid, has a resh and a daled. Those two letters are very crucial letters. If you know the Shema, the last word of the Shema is echad, one. God is one. If you look in a Torah scroll, the daled of echad is a king-size daled. Why? Because you shouldn't confuse it for a very similar letter, which is the resh. Then it would be blasphemy. You would be saying God is another. The word echad would turn into acher. God is another. There is another God, God forbid. So that's why the daled is king size, to make sure you pronounce the word correctly, echad, and not acher. In Leviticus, there's another verse that says, "Don't bow down to another God," acher, also a king size resh. You shouldn't distort it and think it's a daled, and then you would read, "Don't bow down to the one God." So these two letters, resh and daled, are very, very important letters in the context of our belief in one God. Because of the golden calf, what happened is they compromised the resh and the daled. The daled, which reads God is one, was compromised for a resh. They had another God. And the resh, which says don't bow down to another God, they compromised that they substituted it for a daled, that they didn't bow down to the one God. They didn't follow the one God. Now, it says that Moshe came down with the tablets. When he saw them worshiping the golden calf, he shattered the tablets. The question is asked in the Jerusalem Talmud, why did he wait until he descended and he saw the people worshiping the golden calf? God told him that the people had sinned and worshipped a golden calf. Is God not reliable? You know, we're living in the age of fake news. He can be sure that if God reports it, it's not fake news. God tells him that this is what happened. So why didn't he shatter the tablets right away? And the Jerusalem Talmud answers that this teaches you a legal principle. You cannot compare hearing something to seeing it with your own eyes. As the famous saying, folk saying, seeing is believing. And this is a matter of Jewish law. There's a Jewish law that says that if you are a judge and you witnessed a crime, you cannot be a judge in that criminal case because you saw the crime. Why not? Because if you saw the crime, you're not going to be open-minded. You will be biased against that individual because you saw him commit the crime. But what about if you hear witnesses testifying about it? Why aren't you biased then? The answer is because you only hear the witnesses. Here you saw it with your own eyes. And it's impossible for that person to have an open mind, to look for ways that might prove the person is really innocent. That's the lesson you learn from here, that when you see something, it has a much stronger effect. And that points to the importance of what we watch with our eyes. Things that we see have a deeper imprint on our souls, and we should try to expose our eyes only to wholesome and kosher scenes. another explanation, Hasidic twist on it, that Moses heard that they worshiped the golden calf and he knew it was terrible, but he thought, you know what, people sometimes do terrible things. I can't expect everyone to be perfect. That didn't get him to break the tablets. It didn't cause him to get angry. It didn't stir up his anger. What he saw was something that he couldn't stomach. It's not that he saw them worshiping a golden calf. He saw them doing it with so much joy and gusto that he couldn't tolerate. You want to sin, but don't enjoy it. Don't do it with such joy. You do a mitzvah, you do it with joy. You sin, you can't control your evil impulse. He understood that those people were not all perfect. But to enjoy your sin, and this ties in with Purim that we just celebrated, that the reason the Talmud says the Jewish people were threatened with annihilation, God allowed that to happen because of the sin of the people when they were invited to Achashverosh, to his party. They enjoyed the party. And what was wrong with enjoying that party? That party was a celebration of Achashverosh's sense that the Jewish people will never have their land, their independence, and most importantly, their temple back again. And he celebrated that. And when the fact that Jews came to the party, they were forced to come to the party, they had no choice, they felt compelled to do it, but to enjoy your own defeat and that you will never again have a temple, that is unforgivable. Well, the same thing over here. But the fact that they worshiped the golden calf was not half as bad as the fact that they really had a lot of pleasure in doing so. Moses pleads with God, and God says to him that yes, he will forgive the people, and Moses says, I want to see your face. And God says, no, you can only see my back. What does that mean? Seeing God's face, seeing God's back. Some maybe sometimes we can see it a day later, a year later, 100 years later. We then we're able to see why those terrible things happened in retrospect. Moses wanted to see God's face. He wanted to be able to see why everything happens the way it happens, why the good people suffer, why the evil people prosper. Moses asked God, why? The same question that we all ask. I want to see the explanation for it right now. And God says, no, that you can't do. You can only see it in hindsight. Yes, after many years, you see that this event that you thought was terrible really, who knows what it may have done to save lives or any other explanation. You can only appreciate God's ways, if at all, in hindsight. My backwards, not forwards. But then, there's a halacha, there's a law about reading the Megillah. We just came through it. It says if you read the Megillah backwards, you did not fulfill your obligation. What does it mean to read the Megillah backwards? So the simple meaning is that you read the second half before the first half. You come late to shul, and they're in the middle of the Megillah, so you hear the second half, and then you go to another shul and they read the first half. No, they can't do it. You have to read it in order. The Baal Shem Tov said it means that you can't read the Megillah as something of the past. You have to read it as something of the present. And another way of interpreting it is that even though we don't understand God's ways as it happens, we only understand it backwards. We don't look at life waiting to see it backwards. Even as we're going through life, we appreciate everything that God does, and we praise God even when we don't understand His ways. In this Parsha, you also have the laws of Shabbos mentioned 3 times. This is in chapter 31, verse 14. Actually, verse 13, and verse 14. In verse 13 it says, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, you must observe my Sabbaths." Verse 14, "You shall observe the Sabbath." And again, in chapter 31, verse 16, "The children of Israel shall observe the Sabbath." Now, the Hebrew word for observing is shamru, tishmoru, shmartem. The root of the word means guarding. Not observing, but guarding. There's a term in Hebrew, a legal term, for a person who is entrusted with guarding something. He's called a shomer, a guardian. If I go on a vacation and I want someone to keep my car in his garage, he becomes a shomer. If something happens, he might be liable for the damage. It's stolen or something else. There are 3 things that make a person liable when they're guarding something and something happens to it as a result of whatever it is that happened. And you're liable under these 3 conditions. One is called shlichus yad. If you as a guard actually used the thing that you were supposed to guard. Let's say someone says, "I'm keeping my car in your garage, but I don't want you to use it. Just keep it there." And I took the car for a ride, and later on something happens to it, I'm liable. Because by using it, I acquire it, and I'm responsible for whatever damage happens. That's one thing, unauthorized usage of it. Number 2 is if you were negligent. I left the keys in the car, in the ignition, and the garage door was open, and then it was stolen. That's called pshia. That's called negligence. Then you're liable for it. And the third thing is, if something happened and it got lost. A car doesn't get lost so easily. The Talmud talks more about an animal, but things could get lost, and you're liable for it. Well, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, one of the great German Jewish leaders, said that there are 3 things that one could do to violate the Shabbos, violate the guarding of the Shabbos. One is, he doesn't explain, so we'll try to explain it ourselves. One is by using the Shabbos. By using the Shabbos for things that it wasn't intended for. For example, a person takes advantage of Shabbos to discuss business. He's using the Shabbos social setting to further some weekday activity. He's using the Shabbos for his own personal benefit. That's one way of showing disrespect for the Shabbos. The second is negligence, a person who does things on Shabbos that they shouldn't be doing because they don't care about it. And the third is that it gets lost, that a person forgets and they just have no sensitivity to it. At any rate, Shabbos, the guarding of Shabbos, is an integral part of the observance of Shabbos. In the 10 Commandments itself, there are 2 versions of it. In the first version, in Exodus, it says, "Remember the Shabbos." In the book of Deuteronomy, where it repeats the 10 Commandments, it says, "Shomar," guard the Shabbos. And our sages tell us that remembering is to do the positive things. We recite the Kiddush, we light Shabbos candles, we say the prayers, we eat the meals, make Havdalah, the end of Shabbos. And Shomar, guarding, refers to the refraining from doing work on Shabbos. And the 2 words were said by God simultaneously to tell us that they're equally important, that the guarding of the Shabbos, not doing work, is not a negative. It's really what preserves the integrity of the Shabbos. And one final point, when the Torah describes the tablets in plural is called luchos in chapter 31, verse 18, the very last verse of chapter 31. And God gives Moshe the luchos, the tablets. Now in Hebrew, the word luchos, which is plural, usually has a vav in it to make it plural. We have the plural because we have the vowels printed in the printed edition, but in the Torah scroll there are no vowels, and it doesn't have the vav, so the way it's written reads luchas, which is singular. Why is it written in the singular and read in the plural? Because it was plural, but they were really singular. Even though there were two separate tablets, the two tablets are considered to be a unit. Why? The first tablet refers to the obligations between man and God. The second tablet refers to the obligations between man and man. One could have thought that these two tablets are separate. You can be one without the other. Yes, you can be one without the other. And that's something which would be horrible. The people who dropped the first tablet, the belief in God, the respect for God, I could mention a few names, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong, murdered more people than all of the people killed in all of human history. They did it single-handedly, virtually. Three hands were involved in this, these three tyrants, and we can throw in a few more names of communist leaders who did not do things in the name of God. They rejected the first tablet. They were the greatest violators of the second tablet in every aspect, in every one of those five. Then we know people who threw out the second tablet. It's only what I do in relation to God. And we have them today, and we call them ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They talk in the name of God, but they'll chop off heads. No hesitation if anyone just doesn't go along with their tyrannical rule. So you need to put the two tablets together. They complement each other, and they're really two sides of one coin. The Rebbe also emphasizes the fact that the first tablet is mostly positive. Even the ones about not having other gods are derivative of the first commandment, I am the Lord your God. The second tablet is all negative. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Some people think the positive, that's where you can express your Judaism, your faith. The negative is not so important. You could be a good Jew by just doing the positive things, even if you violate the negative. And conversely, some people say, well, I don't do anything wrong. Why do I have to do anything positive? You can't have one without the other. They go together as one unit. I just want to conclude that this week is also Parsha's Parsha. We read an extra reading which talks about the laws of the red heifer, the red cow, which in the days of the temple was used as an atonement or a purification for someone who came in contact with the dead. The Torah says that this red cow ritual is beyond understanding. It's a chok. It's etched in stone. It's beyond logic and rationality. King Solomon couldn't understand it. There's a story in the Talmud of the rabbis in the days of the Second Temple who went searching for a jewel. The jasper was missing from the breastplate of the high priest. And they found out that there was a Roman official in the city of Ashkelon, whose name was Dama ben Nesina, who had that jasper. So they were prepared to pay exorbitant amounts for that jewel, because the high priest had to wear this breastplate with 12 jewels in it, and without that jewel it would be incomplete. Well, he wouldn't sell it to them at first because the key to the box in which he kept it was under his father's pillow, and the father was sleeping. They thought he didn't want to sell it, so they doubled, tripled, quadrupled the price, and he wouldn't sell it to them. When he finally got the key after his father awakened, he ran after them, and he sold them the jewel. They wanted to pay him the highest amount that they offered at the end, but he said, no, I'll just take the original amount because I don't want to profit from my honor of my father. And God rewarded him that a red heifer was born on his farm, and they needed the red heifer in Jerusalem, and the amount of money that he got paid for it was the amount that he could have made from the jewel that he had sold them. The Chedushi Harim, one of the first Gerer Rebbes, the first Gerer Rebbe, great Hasidic master, once explained, why did God reward him with a red heifer. If God wanted to make him rich, he could have found a treasure. He could have invested in a business. There's so many other ways. Why a red heifer? And he answered that it demonstrated. Here it was a Roman official. Romans were not nice people, and this Roman official was probably not the nicest person in other respects, except for honoring his parents. And yet he had so much devotion to his parents, it reflected badly on the Jewish people, that they didn't have that devotion that he had. So God wanted to show that's not exactly the truth. The Jewish people were willing to pay outlandish amounts of money for what? For a ritual that makes no sense. It's only done because God said so. What Dama did to honor his parents was admirable, and we have to learn from him, but it was rational. It makes sense to honor your elders. It makes sense to have respect for the elders and to have continuity. And he deserves all the credit for it, and he was rewarded for it. But the Jewish people have gone way beyond that. They were even prepared to spend everything they have for a red cow that will be used in a ritual that is not rational at all. Have a good Shabbos and a good week.